Welcome to another installment of Conversations Across Generations with the African American Lectionary's Young Ministers Corner. Today we're so excited to have the Reverend Dr. Gina Stewart with us, and we look forward to the great pearls of wisdom that she offers to ministers, young and old alike, as we attempt to forge a way forward for excellence in ministry and thought. We're also joined by Pastor Jeremy Battle of the Western Avenue Baptist Church in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and we look forward to an awesome conversation that will help many of us perfect this craft of preaching and the great blessed burden of ministry that we all undertake. Thank you, Dr. Stewart, for being with us today.
Good to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
So we're at Hampton Ministers Conference, and you may not know this, but you are one of the luminaries for preaching in the black context and in the world context, in my opinion. And so knowing that you have this great command of the craft of preaching, can you give us a peek into your preparation method so we can figure out how you do what you do?
Exactly, how we can get better.
Well, I think one of the things that's most important for me is structure. One of the things Dr. Frank Anthony Thomas talks about a lot, in fact, one of his books is They Like to Never Quit Praising God, which is an excellent book, I think, for any preacher that's looking for a sense of structure in terms of sermon preparation. I was heavily influenced by one of my homiletics professors when I attended Memphis Theological Seminary. He's now deceased, Dr. Paul Brown, who basically emphasized an inductive method to preaching. And of course, one of those things that he often talked about was you have to find a way to build a, if you will, hermeneutical bridge that helps people to connect to the ancient story and make it relevant for their lives. One of the things that he used to emphasize was RLEs, using real-life experiences as a way of engaging people to give them thoughts to hang their hats on. The other thing that has been helpful for me has been, in terms of structure, that part of it is the world behind the text, using different models for sermon preparation. One model that we learned in seminary was world behind the text, world of the text, and world in front of the text, which helps you to do the serious exegetical work, I think, that is so important. Because so often, I heard Reverend Dr. Alvin Jackson say, oftentimes we take a text as a context for what we want to say next. But when you take the time to do the exegetical work, it enlivens and it gives the sermon, in my opinion, a richer kind of texture in terms of its delivery. And then, of course, the certain sound of the trumpet by Dr. Samuel Proctor provides another structure, another way of structuring a sermon, thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, where there's not an either-or type of perspective, but you look at both sides of the coin and then you weave a new conclusion, walk away with a new conclusion. And of course, Dr. Thomas's is situation, complication, and celebration, resolution and celebration. So for me, structure is everything. And then, of course, I think it's important to contemporize our sermons. I used to hear one of my professors say, I think it was Karl Barth, who said, preachers ought to have the Bible in one hand and the New York Times in another, because people are coming to church with questions, and they're coming to church with questions about real issues. And I think that we have an opportunity at the preaching moment to provide perspective, to provide some answers, maybe not conclusively, but to also provide some sense of guidance, moral compassing for people who come to the pews each week. Wanting to know, is there a word from the Lord? And when you look at the kind of culture that we're living in, some of the challenges that we are facing, even as we're here at this conference, I think that the word still has power. And it's incumbent upon us as preachers to really study to show ourselves approved, and to read. And reading is fundamental. They used to say that reading is fundamental. I read everything I can get my hands on, so I read a lot. And a lot of times I'll get a thought from something I'm reading, and I store it for another time. So for me, structure is one of the main things. And then, of course, reading and looking for real life experiences that help to bridge that text and make it come alive.
I think one of the questions that come up every time we have one of these sessions, I mean, we have a young generation of preachers who are now developing. And even as a young pastor, I'm always concerned with developing my own voice and discovering my own call. How do I feel comfortable in my own skin? I mean, there's a lot of preachers who influence me, and if I'm not careful, I can try to imitate them and so on and so forth. When was that time, sort of what was the process, if you don't mind giving us a window in, to you finally becoming Gina?
I think it evolved, and I think that one of the ways it evolves is through opportunity to preach. I was called to the ministry. Well, actually, I started speaking in churches when I was about 18 or 19 years old, and of course, a lot of that was in my home church. And then, as I would speak in my home church, others would start inviting me. And so it was an evolution. It wasn't something that happened overnight. There have always been people whose preaching voices have influenced me over the years. But I think for the most part, it evolved. And I really believe that my preaching voice was really clarified when I started pastoring. Because when you pastor, it's different when you're preaching as a pastor as opposed to an evangelist. Because there's a goal, there's a mission, there's a philosophy that shapes or guides what we preach about on Sunday morning. And one of the things, the decision that I had to make was, do I really want to see people transform, or do I just want to get a response on Sunday morning? And when I made that decision, I believe that really sort of cemented for me the way I preach, the voice that I preach with, and everything. So I would say that it evolves. And of course, in this day where you have Twitter, you have Facebook, you got YouTube, you got the Word Network, it is extremely tempting to mimic somebody else's voice. But I often think about what David said when Saul gave him his armor and told him to go and fight Goliath. He said, I can't use these because I haven't tried them, I haven't tested them. And for me, it's more about being authentically who I am. I think authenticity is important. And if that's not a value for you, then it's very easy to get seduced into trying to be somebody else. But for me, it's about trying to be my most authentic self in terms of my preaching. And that can be a blessing and a curse sometimes, depending on your context. Because I'm one of these kind of preachers. I like to holler, when I, and I like to hoop, and close it and all of that. Of course, I don't start out doing that, but that's my style. But when I'm in places where that's not necessarily the context, I do sometimes find myself being pressured, feel the pressure. I think it's real. And I think we would really be embellishing truth, our truth, if we were to say that it's not tempting. But I think we have to be willing to risk being who we are authentically. Because if we can't take that risk, then we end up just being somebody else. And one of the things that I always tell the ministers in my church, the associate ministers who serve, is be yourself, but be your best self. And I think that's the key, is to be the best you that you can be. I can't be a Dr. Jazz, I can't be a Dr. Elaine Flake, I can't be a Dr. Claudette Copeland or Dr. Renita Weems or whoever, but I can be the best Gina Stewart that I can be. And I think that's really where the rubber meets the road in terms of finding your own voice. And I don't think you find it overnight. I think it's an evolution, and it's strengthened and it grows and it matures. I'm certainly not the same preacher at 52 that I was at 35 when I first started pastoring. I wasn't the same preacher at 35 that I was at 19 or 20 when I was actually speaking. So, but thank God for persons, as Dr. Jazz said today, who opened up their pulpits and let us practice preaching and give us a chance to really find our voice and land someplace that is our most, in my opinion, our most authentic self.
Well, Dr. Stewart, you, as we talk about the pastorate. You are one who, as we've named you, a luminary.
You're so kind. Thank you.
You have a healthy itinerary, and you have a great church. How do you? Can you talk to us about the challenges of balancing being on the road and also pastoring with excellence? Because a lot of young preachers, we want the road.
Right.
We want the road. I mean, we want churches too, but we
Yeah.
also want the road.
Yeah.
So can you give us some inclination of how you balance it?
There are two things that immediately come to mind. One, you have to have strong, equipped people that you can delegate responsibilities to, that you can trust, and who have been equipped to function in your absence. You know, the Bible does say that he gave pastors, prophets, evangelists, teachers, and apostles to prepare God's people for works of service. So one of our primary roles, I think, as a pastor is to equip people in the congregation so that the people can receive ministry not just from you as the senior pastor. It's not even realistic, especially when you start to experience growth. When you have growth, you will. It's sort of like what Jethro said to Moses: "You will surely die if you try to do all of it." And so, one of the things that, and I know it was just the Lord. In my early days of pastorate, I spent pastoring or the pastorate. I spent a lot of time investing in key leaders and people who were really energized about the vision that God had given me. They were in their early 20s, late 20s, and they were fired up about Jesus and loved the Lord, and I invested in them. And many of them now are serving in fact, one of my main associate pastors was one of those that I invested in. So now, when I'm on the road, he's actually on staff at the church, and I'm able to delegate responsibilities to him. And of course, staffing is another thing. When you have the staff that can help extend your ministry when you're not present, it also helps. And then I think the other thing is knowing when to say no. Obviously, you can't go everywhere. And this is what I say to people. There are some limits. I have a certain number of Sundays that I will take. You know, if I took every engagement that people extended to me on Sundays, I probably wouldn't be pastoring. They would put me out. But, you know, I understand that my first priority is to Christ Missionary Baptist Church. But it also helps that I have a congregation who understands my assignment, that my gift is not just for Christ Missionary and not just for South Memphis, but the gift is for the world. And they have freed me up and given me permission to travel. And of course, that was not something that happened overnight either. I'd say probably I've been pastoring 17 years. And I would say maybe the first 5 to 7 years, I was not traveling as much as I travel now. So some things, some capital you have to earn. You know, you have to make those deposits.
Yes,
you know, you can't go in trying to be out of the pulpit every other week. But when you've taken care of your people, when you've pastored the people, when you've done pastoral care, you get what they, and I'm using this as a word picture, capital. You need capital. And I'm not saying that in terms of money. I'm saying that in terms of trust and release, because then you have demonstrated a level of integrity and commitment to the congregation that even if they don't like it when you're not there, they release you and they give you permission because they know at the end of the day you're coming back home.
Yes, ma'am.
So it's something that you do over time, but you still have to have wisdom. You know, you can't, and you have to know your context. Like I have some colleagues that travel a lot more, but they have an agreement with their congregation. I don't have what do you call an official agreement, but I try to use wisdom and say, okay, you know, you don't need to be missing twice in the same month if you can help it, or you know, a lot of times I try not to even be gone once every month. There may be some periods, but it's just a matter of, especially on Sundays.
Right.
Now, when you talk about revivals, I usually try to schedule those so that I'm not out of the office the whole month either.
Yeah.
So wisdom plays a major role in how I choose where I will go. And then, just because somebody invites you, I don't necessarily think it's always your assignment either.
Oh, wow.
So you have to be prayerful too about where you go, and you have to be clear about what your assignment is. And I know that for this season, while I do walk in the office of an evangelist, I believe that because I do travel a lot, I know that my main assignment right now is to pastor Christ Missionary Baptist Church, and so that has to be a priority for me.
I think one of the things that comes up, for a younger generation, there's an eagerness.
Yes.
And sometimes this leads to impatience.
Yes.
And sometimes it, in a certain way, hinders faithfulness.
Yes.
And so you've been talking about the pastor. I'm a young pastor. I just began my pastorate. Pastoring is difficult.
Yes.
It is a hard task.
Yeah.
And for someone who has been doing it for 17 years, who's been also evangelizing, what would you say to a young generation? How do you do it? I mean, where's the source? Of course, it's God is our source, our strength. But what are the sort of practices that you have developed, in terms of sort of pastoral care and your own practices that have sort of kept you, kept a level mind, allowed you to pastor well, with such great excellence as you have over the years?
Several things come to mind. One of the first things is prayer. Statistics say that pastors only get to pray about 20 minutes a day. That is ministerial suicide. For me, the intentionality about cultivating the inner life through prayer and worship, through spiritual disciplines, is indispensable. I just don't think you can last without a vital and flourishing prayer life. Now, that's not to say that I'm always, up in a retreat center on a mountain somewhere looking at a rock or staring at water. But I think that we do have to be very intentional as pastors about guarding the inner life. We have to be really intentional about that, making sure that there's time for our own worship. That's why these kind of meetings are important to me, because with the same amount that you give out, you also need to be refilled. I think that's why so many pastors end up burned out. They end up falling into sin and falling into temptation because we don't necessarily practice those spiritual disciplines. The other thing is self-care. Now, I was set free in seminary. I remember taking a pastoral care class from Dr. Kathy Reed. I will never forget this because I was in a milieu that emphasized that the more busy you are and the more you spend yourself in ministry and basically neglect yourself, the more committed you are. I picked that up in the atmosphere. That was never said to me directly, but I picked it up, and I remember her saying, self-care is not selfishness, it's good stewardship.
Wow.
Taking care of yourself, taking care of your body, giving yourself permission to have a life is very important. And you have to teach your people that. Because in the African American tradition, and we are in a day now of mega churches where people do have multi-staff. But in a smaller context, people are used to the pastor being the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, the fire chief, the cook. You do it all. And you have to teach people and equip people that while the pastor is a gift to the congregation, there are other gifts that need to be embraced as well. And you have to teach them that you do ministry, but you're not Superman or Superwoman. And you do it in a body that gets tired, that needs rest. And you look at Jesus as a model. I mean, when you read the Gospels, Jesus would break away from the crowd. Early in the morning while it was still dark, he got up and went to a solitary place, and there he prayed. One of the passages in Mark I love where he was praying, and Peter and some of us said, everybody's looking for you. And Jesus said, no, we're going to another town. He didn't camp out in Capernaum. He moved right on. He said, because this is why I have come. So a sense of missionality, being missional, knowing what I've been called to do. I remember when I first started, before I started pastoring, I used to narrate for a community choir. and I used to MC a lot of concerts and things like that. And I knew very instinctively and very clearly that there were some things I couldn't do anymore when I started pastoring. So people would call and say, well, we need you to MC this, or we need you to come. And I said, I can't do that anymore. But here's a name. Because as I was shifting, it was a door that God was opening for somebody else. Same thing when I can't take engagements. Sometimes I think God allows us to be in these places so we can usher other people into the room. Because my lack of availability has meant a door that is open for somebody else. So a sense of missionality, knowing what I'm called to do, is real important. And then the other is pastoral care. You've got to take care of your people. Yeah, I'm one of those from the old school that still believes that you need to visit folk, you still need to go and see people, you still need to check on your people, you need to take care of your people. Shepherding is a part of what we do. And even though I do have pastors now, and I've trained the deacons to do pastoral care, we enrolled our congregation in the Stephen ministry about 3 years after I started pastoring, because I kept saying to our congregation, it's part of my job to take care of you. But if I'm going to be effective, and if I'm going to last, and my shelf life is going to last, I'm going to not expire before my time, you're going to have to learn to receive ministry from other people. Not me or them, but both of us.
Right.
So, because if you're at Baptist East and somebody else is at St. Francis and your surgeries are the same time, I haven't figured out yet how to be ubiquitous. So what that means is you're going to have to receive somebody else's care. And they have done well with receiving care from others, but they're always glad when they see the pastor.
Right.
So pastoral care has been essential. I would say that it really turned my ministry around. It's what helped some of the people, because let's face it, there were people who were not, throwing confetti when I was elected. They did not necessarily think that a woman could handle pastoring a church. Age and gender was not in my favor, nor marital status. I was single, I was 35, and a woman. And there were people who could accept me as a minister, but not as a pastor. But when you visit people, when you're there for people in their darkest moments, they never forget it. So pastoral care, I would tell any young preacher, master pastoral care. You take care of your congregation, they will take care of you. And it's not one of those situations where, I scratch your back, you scratch mine. You do it because it's part of what you're called to do. It's part of what you're called to do. So I would say prayer, having a prayer life, a commitment to pastoral care, equipping the people, and then a commitment to your own professional development. I do try to attend certain conferences. I make it a point to attend. Well, I'm a trustee for Samuel DeWitt Proctor, but I make it a point, even before I became a trustee, I attended their conference. I come to Hampton Ministers Conference. I'm a co-convener for Women in Ministry, hosted by Dr. Cynthia Hale is the convener, but there are several of us that co-convene with her. Before I became a co-convener, I attended that. I attend like Carrie, because again, you need to be poured into as well. So a commitment to my own professional development. I went back to school and finished my DMin, and actually thinking about going back to school again, because I think you need to be a lifelong learner. The culture is shifting so much that we can't afford to, just go and isolate ourselves and not be stretched intellectually. And then having a peer network. I was a team leader for the Lot Carey Pastoral Excellence Program for about 6 years. And that was one of the main things they talked about, was how important it is for pastors not to work in isolation, but to have a network of peers who can support us. Because when you're working in the pastorate, you will think that you're the only one with the problems that you have. Wow. Until you start talking to somebody else. Then you say, oh, you have that problem too? It's the same everywhere.
Wow.
Same everywhere.
So how have you been able to negotiate some of the challenges of being in a mainline mainline denomination that historically, and there's still vestiges of this,
Right.
that do not, churches that do not support women in ministry, particularly in the pastoral capacity?
The instances, actually, to be honest, have been very minimal. I mean, there are people that still don't believe it because and that still have issues because the South is very conservative. In fact, I have more problems with people joining my church with the things that people say to my members than I do with dealing with colleagues. Most of the people in Memphis, most of the guys in Memphis are really very open. There are a few, and I've had some instances even as a pastor where I've gone to churches and the pastor has either called ahead of time and said, I need you to sit on the floor, don't take the pulpit. But it's only been a couple of times. But for the most part, the problem, the greater problem that I've encountered in my own context has been when people join my church and then they say to my members, you're going to hell because you're under a woman. Or, the Bible says that a woman ought to not exercise authority over men. So it's that biblical literalism. It's still the vestiges of sexism that are still existent. And then just bad theology that people have just heard down through the years. So one of the things that I usually try to recommend to my members, there's a book I was introduced to several years ago called What Paul Really Said About Women by Stuart Bristow. And so I usually recommend to members that they read that book because I say to them, people can have their opinion, but you need to be clear. And if you're clear, it doesn't really matter what people say because the scripture says you know by your fruit, not by your pastor. And is God really that narrow that God would base your eternal destiny on somebody's gender? So it's an opportunity to stretch people theologically too. And make them think, like Reverend Jazz said this morning, make God bigger than God has been for a number of people. So it hasn't been so much of the opposition from people who say, well, you can't come to our church because you're a female. But most of it has really been with people that will challenge people that join our church to say, well, you ought not be under one. Now, they've been worshiping at Bedside Baptist for the last 10 years. And then they'll come and join and they'll have a family member or they'll go on their job and somebody you over there with that Gina Stewart. And woman over there on Parkway. but actually, there have been some other women that have been elected as pastors in Memphis. Reverend Mary Moore was elected about 3 years after I was. She's since retired and is now working as an assistant pastor to one of our colleagues. Reverend Sandra Hayes was elected to First Baptist Chelsea. She's deceased. And then Reverend Lynn Dandridge is pastoring one of the mainline Baptist churches. She followed Dr. Reuben Green at Central Baptist Church. She was like a daughter of the church like I was. So there are a few other women that have actually been called to pastor churches locally since I was called.
I guess another question that I would ask, there's no question that from your viewpoint you have been able to look down and you have been able to see a developing younger generation of preachers. I wonder if there are a set of concerns or if there's one charge that you would give that you have noticed that you would just pour down and you would pass on to us.
Oh yeah. One of my passions is helping younger ministers to be profitable where they are. See, I guess because I was a female, because guys often can preach a sermon and get called to the church in a matter of months. That's the way it was when I was growing up. But I was called to ministry, and like David, I went back to the pasture. David was crowned. He went back to tending sheep.
Right.
I was ordained, and I started serving in my local church. And I think so often this issue of impatience and wanting to get somewhere fast gets in the way. I believe that God always has a prepared place for prepared people. And so one of the things that I did, two things I did. I was called to ministry. I immediately enrolled in seminary because I felt that a person's soul is the most precious thing they have. If a doctor goes to medical school, if a person goes to dental school to prepare to work on my mouth, etc., then I need to be trained theologically. Not necessarily going in to find God. I needed to know God before I went. But I do believe that you need the tools that seminary, the intellectual stretching that seminary does, the building networks with other friends, other people and colleagues, the collegiality that a seminary experience offers. But I also think that one of the things that we have often tried to bypass now in this contemporary time of ministry and televangelism and word network and buildings, bodies, cars, cash, and cameras is the element of servanthood. You know, everybody is ready to be wonderful and to be a wonder. But service is the pathway to promotion. It's the pathway to promotion. I served for about 5 years under my pastor. And I did whatever he told me to do. You know, if he wanted me to help at the table, I helped do that. If he wanted me to go visit somebody, I went to visit. Whatever he needed me to do, I made myself available to help him. And, of course, he did give me opportunities to preach. But that was not something I felt like I was entitled to. I think that's another challenge. A lot of young preachers think you owe them a preaching engagement. But it's a gift. It's a gift. If the pastor is gracious enough to allow you the opportunity to preach, it's a gift, but it's not an entitlement. To me, the key is to serve. And I served, you know, I went to school, I worked full time, I went to seminary, worked full time. But here's what happened. My pastor had a massive heart attack in a restaurant. I was in my last year of seminary. He had a massive heart attack. The church had to find a pastor. And as God would have it, we went through the process, and I ended up being elected. But the time that I spent serving him prepared me for this moment. Because there's some things you can't learn in seminary. Some stuff is caught, not taught. And it's amazing the things when I would be at the table and I said, whatever, you know, you can go to seminary, you can learn the technical aspect of it, but the practical, the theology, you get it in service. You get it hanging out, the nuggets that you get just from being around other preachers and other pastors. When my pastor died, the Reverend Shirley Prince, well, actually we became friends before he died, and she poured a lot into me. She used to be a pastor over at Mississippi Boulevard, one of the staff pastors at Mississippi Boulevard, and I would go with her just to make hospital visits. We would go to lunch, but she would say, now, Rhoda, we need to stop by Baptist on the way to lunch, and I would watch, because there's certain things that are just caught.
Right.
And so by the time I started pastoring, I'd had some exposure to those things that I probably would have been trying to feel my way had I not just made myself available to serve. So I think that, and I'm not saying that young preachers don't do that, but I think that that's the impatience often hijacks servanthood. I shouldn't say servitude. There's a difference between servitude and servanthood. Servitude is involuntary.
Right.
Servanthood is voluntary.
Right.
And so it's easy when you just decide, I'm here to help.
Right.
You know, what can I do to help lighten the load? And you'd be surprised at how God will open doors and the opportunities that God will create. I never would have dreamed in all of my wildest imagination that I would be pastoring a church. Never. I didn't even have it on my mind. I remember saying to some friends, when I was working on my master's in education, I had just recently been called to the ministry. We were talking about in our next life, you know. And I remember saying, I could really enjoy working in ministry full time. But I had chaplaincy on my mind. maybe doing the work of an evangelist on the weekends. And because I was a director of admissions for a community college, Shelby State. So I could see myself going to heaven from Shelby State. Nobody could have paid me to believe. If somebody had said to me, 17 years from now, you'll be pastoring a church, I would have never believed it. I never would have believed it. Never would have believed it. And even when my pastor passed and the church was beginning the search, I did not initially submit my resume because I didn't feel that the church was ready. Our denomination has historically been somewhat biased against women in ordained clergy positions. So I didn't think that, I didn't think that it would happen. But God has a sense of humor. And God is amazing. So I'm telling you, and I say this to people all the time, God's way of doing things, his ways are not our ways. His thoughts are not our thoughts. Alicia Britt Chalet talks about Jesus' hidden years in that book, Anonymous. And she talks about how even though Jesus was hidden for more than half of his life, it was those years of hiddenness that prepared him for when he went public.
Wow.
Because he was building his roots so that when he did go public, he would not self-destruct.
Wow.
And so often we want to go public before we even have an opportunity to build, to have our roots to run deep.
You do a lot of teaching around the world, around the country, and particularly at Christ Missionary Baptist Church. What would you say Christ Missionary Baptist Church has taught you?
Do you mean as a pastor?
As a pastor.
Well, there are a number of things that Christ Missionary has taught me. One thing that Christ Missionary Baptist Church has taught me is that the greatest transformation sometimes is the transformation that takes place in myself. Pastoring is an invitation to die. It's an invitation to grow up and mature. It's an invitation to love people unconditionally. And even though, we represent God, we are spiritual, we don't always act spiritual. And one of the things that I've learned, because, when you pastor a church, there are a lot of dynamics at work, a lot of personalities. And I've learned that one of the greatest transformations that often takes place is a transformation that takes place in myself. We're quick to say, well, if they would just act right, and if they would just do this, and if they would just do that. But I've noticed that my own transformation has taken place. I've learned to trust the Lord. We went through a building project. I've learned the importance of maintaining your integrity. No matter how bad you want something, to do it with integrity and then trust God, to watch God work behind the scenes and in your behalf. I've learned the importance of how important it is to have integrity to a people, because people, what you do impacts not just yourself. There's a whole line of people that could end up falling by the wayside because of the way that we live our lives. And of course, patience. I've learned a great deal of patience, not only in terms of just waiting for things and because we come into ministry with all these great ideas. We want to turn the world upside down in 90 days, but you learn timing, and you learn to trust God's timing, and you learn to sometimes you have to wait for people to catch up. Sometimes you have ideas, but it's not the season. I remember when I wanted to ordain women as deacons, and you would think that having a woman pastor, women deacons would have been a no-brainer. But I learned that you got to choose your battles, And so even though they were ready for, well, most of them were ready for a female pastor, everybody was not ready. And so you got to teach, you got to model, you got to lift up examples, you have to expose so that people's playing field in terms of their mental playing field is expanded. And so I think one of the greater things is to learn learn to choose your battles. You don't have to fight everything, and you don't have to kill everything. Some stuff you need to let it die on its own. Especially if it's not killing anything.
Wow.
I had Reverend Prince used to say to me all the time, Rhoda, if it's not killing anything, and it's not stopping ministry, it's not hindering congregational advancement, some things will die on their own. And so often, we're real zealous, and like I said, we want to do this, and Lord, God forbid, if we've been in seminary, we got all these great ideas. We want to test it out in the next 6 months, and we have ourselves on these schedules, and I think that's another important thing that, because we often have these benchmarks, and I think it's good to have goals, but I think in the wisdom of God, sometimes God does allow delay, because at the end of the day, we need to know that it's about God and not about, that the excellency of the power is of God and not of us. And that people can be your greatest asset. I say often that the most dominant gift in our church is helps. When our people really get behind something, they can do anything they want. They could probably build a building if they wanted to. Because when they really buy into a vision, they will do whatever they have to do to make it happen. I mean, whatever they have to do. And without the resources, with or without the resources, and they do it with joy. So I've learned that when you give people, when you believe in people, and you see something in people, sometimes they don't even see it in themselves. I've had members say to me, Pastor, I never did think I could do this. But when you challenge me, I'm amazed that I'm even doing what I'm doing right now. So when you give people a reason to believe in themselves, it's amazing what they are able to accomplish. People that just sitting on the field, waiting for an opportunity to be asked, waiting for invitation, for a summons.
Wow. If there was something you could say to every young preacher, what would it be?
I think that when we look at what's going on in preaching arenas, and we know that falls happen all the time. This is not the first time people have had a fall. But the plethora of scandal that surrounds Christendom, and how in many ways postmodernity, which already has issues, in terms of moral relativism and a rejection of absolute and objective truth, I think that the best thing that we can do is be accountable. Have systems of accountability. I was teasing Dr. Frank Thomas when we were listening to the lecture today, and Dr. Goldman was talking about how can you be a missionary and not be a part of a local church. And I was teasing Dr. Frank Thomas because he did a lecture once about a teachable spirit. And he said, he referenced a quote by Malcolm X. He said that in one of Malcolm X's books, it said, he bowed to Allah and he was changed. And Dr. Thomas said, there must always be somebody in your life who can say cease and desist. And so I think that accountability, because we are in a time now where nobody wants to be accountable. We are our own bishop, pope, potentate, magistrate, apostle, archbishop. I mean, we don't want to be accountable. But I think that there has to be somebody in your life. Every pastor needs a pastor. Dr. Cynthia Hill is my pastor. Every pastor needs a pastor, but we also need Nathans in our lives. We need people who will challenge us and not just agree with us and tell us what we want to hear. We need people who will call us into question. And my sister is my Nathan. She's the person that I tease her all the time. I said, you're the only person that acts like I'm not your pastor. You talk to me like I'm a tramp off the street sometimes. But we need people in our lives, because given to our own devices, we will self-destruct. And it may not necessarily be the will of God, but God may permit it, because we still have free will, and we still can make choices. And like Bishop Jones said last night, we want the benefits of free will and free choice, but we don't want the consequences. And there are probably, many of us have been saved because there was somebody in our ear saying, no, I don't think that's a good idea. You know, the Bible says in a multitude of counsel there is safety. And so, you know, you need other people around you, and you need other people with a different perspective. Everybody doesn't need to be singing the same song. Or that believing all your press releases. So I would say accountability. Because even in our local churches, you all probably know, I'm sure you know this as a pastor, and you've probably seen it too. People don't want to be accountable. Don't want to be accountable and don't want to wait. Don't want to wait. But good things come to those that wait. I'll tell you this, and I'm sure we have to end. Shortly before my pastor died, a couple of colleagues called me and said, they named the church, and they said, we believe they're ready for a woman pastor. I said, oh, really? They said, yeah. They said, we believe you would be the right one. I said, really? They said, yeah. They said, think about it and let us know. And I went to God about it. I prayed about it. And I never heard God answer. I never got an answer from God, not a clear one. So I told him, I said, you know, I'm really, really humbled and honored by the invitation to consider submitting, but I don't believe that this is my assignment right now. I said, I believe God wants me to stay where I am and help my pastor. I'm telling you, within 6 months, that man was dead. Had I moved on that phone call out of impatience or just not seeking God, I possibly would have missed where I am.
Wow.
Because what would it look like to go and partner with the people, be installed and say, well, this is a marriage, you know, it's going, and then the church where I grew up become vacant, and then I want to shift.
Right.
So there are some benefits, and I'm not saying waiting passively. You know, I think waiting is active.
Sure.
You know, as you're waiting, you're preparing. But I do think learning to just wait your turn is really important. Because God ain't never late. Even when God is late, God is on time. We heard that last night. Woo! Sound like a sermon getting ready to get started. Get you cooking in here. Yes. So I would say accountability and serving and learning patience.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stewart, for sitting with us today. It's been a great joy to have the world sit at your great feet.
Listen at you.
And we're very
you all
sure.
inspire us, though. Because your generation, I think, helps to keep us relevant. You bring another perspective and another vantage point that I think is really needed. So it's not to say that, you know, the younger generation is not a blessing, especially in this age of technology. I think it's a great season to have younger people around us because you are the group that we're really trying to reach. That is beginning to see what we do as extremely irrelevant. So we praise God for people like you all who are, you know, preparing yourself and serving the Lord and really trying to do it with excellence and with passion. We're blessed to have you around too. And to have somebody to hand this stuff off to. That's what I keep telling the young folk. I said, look, I'm getting out of here. I'm trying to hand this off to you. Come on now.
Thank you so much.
God bless you. Thank you so much. I appreciate the invitation.
So much.